Welcome back, everyone. Shannon and I are still here to answer listener questions. And Shannon, I think it's my turn to answer one, right?
Yes, so we got a question from Vikram, and he says, I'm having a hard time deciding whether or not to send my scores to the schools where I'm applying. We're also looking at some business schools, and it's hard to know what makes for good test scores at those schools. How do we decide whether or not to send standardized test scores?
So this is the question these days.
Yeah.
I was part of a webinar doing question and answer yesterday, and I would say there were 5 questions right off the bat about it, and then there were like follow-up questions, and what about this student for this school for this score? Unfortunately, we can't get that specific, but in general, what you want to do is only send your scores if they are in the top 50% of the range for that school. Right? So you're going to need to look it up each school to school, unless you have like a 1550, in which case just submit it. You're totally fine. Like even a 1500, really, just go ahead and submit it. But otherwise it's going to vary from the school, right? Like what Brown is going to want is going to be different from what Penn State, you know, you're going to need to have per Penn State,
Right.
et cetera, et cetera. Now, how do you look up what the average test scores are? Some colleges have published it on their website, so it's always good to look it up and see if they have that published there. Generally speaking, it'll be on like a profile of entering students, you know, the class of 2026, that kind of a thing. If they don't have it, though, you can look it up on College Navigator. So the website is just if you do a search for College Navigator, you should find it. You can plug in the name of the school, and then under admissions, you can look up the test scores. Now, typically what they give is the mid 50% range, meaning that 25% of the scores are below and 25% are above. I like it that way. I think it gives a nice span, but it can be confusing for students because they think, well, if I'm in the mid 50%, I'm fine, right? I mean, they're
I'm in there somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. But the fact is that often students who are scoring below that mid 50% range, the reason they're getting in is they're in a special category, right? Maybe they're a recruited athlete. We all know that athletes can have much lower test scores, things like that. I mean, out of school, if they are a formal recruit, right? So they might be in some sort of special category. If you are not in one of those special categories, you need to take a good long look and an honest look at your scores and say, are these really in the upper 50%? And then the tough part is that it even gets more complicated, potentially depending on your major. If you want engineering, your math score should probably be in the top 25%, right? Other pieces to think about, is your transcript really strong? If you have a super strong transcript without any like apparent weaknesses, then that's another reason where if you're on the fence to maybe not submit your test scores. However, if your transcript shows some weaknesses and your test scores, like maybe you got like a B in a math class and you want engineering or something like that, but your math score is really strong, then maybe that's a time to send your test scores, even if they're on the edge. So it is a little complex, but the basic rule, are you in the top 50%? If so, go ahead and please submit. Now, I will warn people too that this is why there's a lot of grade or test score inflation going on, because this is what we advise everybody to do. And I don't know what else to advise them. I don't want somebody to be a sacrificial lamb to keep those averages below, but you'll see that test score averages are increasing because so many schools are test optional.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting phenomenon.
Yeah.
We want to advise top 50%, but that's going to get higher and higher as only the people with good test scores submit them and nobody with below average test scores submits them. That average is going to creep and it's going to get more difficult as time goes on.
Exactly. On the other hand, the good news I can give people is that test optional does mean test optional. I mean, we keep getting that question. And like one father said to me, well, won't they know that my son's test score was below average if he doesn't submit? And I'm like, well, if he does submit, they will definitely know it was below average.
Right.
But I promise you that if you don't submit the test score, they don't have to factor it in. They will just look at his transcript. That is how it works. Now, I think there was actually research done that looked at students who applied test optional to schools versus those who submitted their test scores, and there was not differences in rate of admission. I think the only difference was some schools really want test scores for scholarships. So have you found that to be the case, Shannon?
Yeah, though I found that to be the case early on in the pandemic, for sure, as schools who had just gone test optional, schools who had never been test optional before, and everybody was kind of making it up as they go along and figuring out how are they going to do both admissions review and also scholarship review. So it was more the case I found early on in the pandemic where a number of schools were test optional for admissions, but still required them for scholarships. I recently tried to find a school that fell into that category where test optional for admissions, but they would not consider you for scholarships without testing. I literally could not find one school that fell into that category where they were absolutely required for all scholarships. Listeners, write into us if you know of a school, let me know, because I would love to dig deeper into it. What does still exist at some schools where they might submitting testing, if it is high, which is the key, if it is high, may qualify you for a higher level scholarship. That still exists at some colleges. You can see them. A lot of the large state universities actually just kind of publish charts. If you have this GPA, you get this scholarship. And you will see if you start reviewing a bunch of those, as I have, like somebody with a 3.5 GPA and no testing gets one scholarship, but a 3.5 GPA and a 1400 on an SAT gets you a little bit more scholarship. So that phenomenon can exist if the testing is quite high. Essentially, the colleges, I think what's going on is they want to encourage the submission of testing from their highest testers, because then they can report what high test scores they have, and it helps them move up in the US News and World Report rankings and all of that. So they want to encourage submission of the testing from the very highest testers so they can kind of brag about it. But if you're not going to be in that category, more likely than not, you're fine without any testing. Again, I haven't seen it anymore that it's absolutely required across the board for any scholarships. You will normally have scholarship consideration without testing. Again, at some schools, maybe you might qualify for higher with testing if it is quite high, but if it's not going to be quite high, then it's not going to help you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I think it's my turn to ask you a question, even though we both got involved in that last one. So, all right. So Malik says, we've got some college savings in a 529, enough for around 2 years of college, but not enough to cover all 4 years. Do we just pay for the first couple of years in full out of the 529 and then borrow the rest?
Yeah, so this is another big it depends question, and different families will make different decisions here. But I'll tell you, Malik, a few things you might want to consider. Number one, 529's college savings plan, where you get a tax break for saving for college. You don't have to pay any taxes, tax-free essentially account. Your savings will grow tax-free here. You get that tax break if you use the money for college. If you use it for anything else, you have to pay taxes on the earnings at your ordinary income tax rate plus a 10% penalty. So you do want to be quite sure that you use this money for college. Otherwise, you're getting hit with taxes and penalties. That would argue for using up that money as soon as possible, because God forbid you don't use the 529 on that first year, and then your child drops out of college after the first year. You don't have anybody else to spend the money on their college, and so you've got to pay the penalty just to get your money out. So that would argue for spending that 529 as soon as possible. Some folks right now, their 529 savings are down. If it was invested in the stock market, they might be hoping for a turnaround. Some people are wanting to let it ride. That might be a factor if you are heavily invested in the stock market, which you might not want to be if your child is just about to go off to college. But it's a factor to think about. A couple other quick things to think about. If you may qualify for the American Opportunity Tax Credit. Dig back into our archives. We've done segments on the tax breaks for paying for college. If you might qualify for that tax break, the government doesn't let you double dip and get 2 tax breaks for the same payment. So you can't get the American Opportunity Credit for payments made out of a 529. So you might want to pay some money not out of the 529 from some other source, including student loans count, to make sure that you qualify for that tax credit, which is essentially $2,500 of free money. You want to make sure you get that. And you need to pay at least $4,000 out of pocket to qualify for that tax break. So that's something to think about. And also, the direct student loans that I mentioned that the students can borrow, they're at a very good interest rate in the student's name. Don't have to make payments till after graduation, flexible repayment options. Essentially, those direct student loans are kind of the best loans you can get in the student loan market. And they have annual limits that I talked about, the $5,500 to $7,500. If you don't take the student's freshman year eligibility in a direct loan, that $5,500, you can't get it back and like add it on to the senior year loan amount. You have those limits each year. So if you are eventually going to need to borrow, you might want to be borrowing those student loans kind of all along. Hold back, don't pay everything out of the 529. Take the student loans as you're eligible for them each year because they are the best kind of deal you can get in the loan market. If you didn't borrow it all, paid everything out of the 529 for the first couple years, by the time you got to junior and senior year, you might have to borrow very heavily in a less favorable loan with a higher interest rate. So you might want to think about is kind of spacing that 529 out, divide it evenly over the 4 years, and take the direct student loans that you can get. Maybe you can pay the difference out of pocket. That's a game plan that works for a lot of people. But again, it's going to differ for every family.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Shannon.
You're so welcome.
All right. And thanks also to Karen Spencer for joining us. Be sure to join us next week when we'll be discussing the Apply Texas and the University of California applications. So if you're applying to any public schools in either of those states, you should definitely find this quite helpful. Also, remember to rate us on iTunes. It really helps other people find us, makes us very happy, and makes us feel famous. And you can find us every Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific on Voice America. Have a great week.